On the 17th of November, 1972, in a kitchen on the top floor of a Chelsea apartment building, a 51-year-old woman in a couture dress lay on her back on the tiles. A single kitchen knife had entered her chest and stopped her heart in less than a minute. Her son, 26 years old, beautiful, sick, and the last male heir of an industrial fortune that had built half the modern world, stepped over her body and picked up the telephone. He did not call for an ambulance. He did not call for the police. He called a Chinese restaurant. He placed an order for takeaway. Then he sat down to wait. If you find yourself drawn to the stories the polished biographies leave out, the ones that show what extreme wealth does to the people inside it, subscribe so you do not miss the next one. Chapter 1. The Father Who Walked into the Garage. Before Barbara Daly was old enough to understand the word fortune, she had already learned what abandonment smelled like. It was carbon monoxide. It was a closed garage door in Cambridge, Massachusetts, in January of 1933. It was the exhaust of her father's car running for as long as it took. Frank Daly was a salesman in a textile firm that was barely holding on through the third winter of the Great Depression. He had a wife. He had a daughter, 11 years old, with auburn hair and an old soul in her eyes. He had nothing else. He had been beaten down for so long that the simplest path out of the house seemed, on a Tuesday morning, to be the path that involved a hose and a locked door. Barbara was the one who, by family account, was nearby when the body was found. She was the one who watched her mother collapse. She was the one who, for the rest of her life, would react to the word goodbye as if it were the first sound of a long and irreversible disaster. Her mother, Nini, was not equipped to absorb the loss. Nini had already, years before Barbara was born, suffered what was then called a nervous breakdown. She had been hospitalized. She had been written up. She had been treated with the limited methods of the 1920s, which were largely the methods of bed rest and persuasion. She was a fragile woman who carried herself with the particular straight-back dignity of women who know they are one bad week away from coming apart again. Frank's suicide put her into that bad week and into the one after it. The two of them, mother and child, left Cambridge within months. They moved to New York. They took up residence at the Delmonico Hotel on Park Avenue, in rooms paid for in part by relatives and in part by the small life insurance policy Frank had left behind. The Delmonico was not the Plaza. It was a respectable hotel that catered to widows and travelers, the kind of place where you could keep your dignity even after the money had thinned. Barbara learned in those years the precise difference between a hotel that was respectable and a hotel that was fashionable. She learned which streets her mother could afford and which ones she could only walk through. She learned to look at clothing in shop windows the way other girls looked at saints in churches. By the time she was 14, she had decided what her life was going to be. By the time she was 17, she had begun to do it. She had inherited her mother's bone structure, her father's red-brown hair, and an instinct for self-presentation that was almost military in its discipline. She walked into the offices of the modeling agencies that supplied girls to the New York fashion magazines, and she was hired. She posed for Harper's Bazaar. She posed for Vogue. She was listed at 20 on one of those magazine-compiled rosters of the 10 most beautiful young women in New York. She was, for a brief season, one of the faces that wealthy mothers cut out and showed their sons. She was studying. Every photograph, every paid afternoon, every dinner at someone else's apartment was tuition. She watched the way the editors held their gloves. She watched the way the heiresses paused at the door to be looked at. She watched the way money behaved when it was old enough to be quiet. She copied. She refined. She invented a backstory in which the Dallas of Cambridge were a family of old Massachusetts stock with a faint Irish gentry connection on her father's side. She invented schools she had not attended. She invented summers in Maine she had not had. The international set into which she was preparing to enter would not, she had already understood, check. She had no fortune behind her. She had no name behind her. She had a dead father and a fragile mother and a small hotel suite and a face that other people wanted to be near. She intended to make the face do the work that a name would have done. She had also already absorbed a lesson that would shape every subsequent decision of her life. The lesson was that the people you love can leave at any time, by methods you cannot prevent, for reasons that have nothing to do with you. The only protection against that, she had decided, was to never let yourself be the one who could be left. The only way to never be left was to become so necessary, so beautiful, so indispensable to the household of a powerful man that he would not be able to imagine the room without you in it. In 1942, in California, she found the powerful man. She walked into a room and met Brooks Baekeland. He was 22 years old, tall, contemptuous, blue-eyed, and the grandson of one of the great industrial inventors of the previous century. Barbara, looking at him, did not see only the husband. She saw the door. She told him within weeks that she was pregnant. She was not. By the time he understood that, they were married. Chapter 2. The Belgian Chemist Who Built an Empire. While Barbara was learning how to be beautiful, a dead man's invention was waiting for her in a laboratory in Yonkers. The dead man was Leo Hendrik Baekeland. He was Belgian. He had been born in Ghent in 1863 to a cobbler father and a housemaid mother. He had taken his doctorate in chemistry at the University of Ghent at the age of 21. He had emigrated to the United States in 1889 with a young wife and a head full of ideas about photographic chemistry. He had been a man who did not stop working, who did not stop reading, who did not stop testing hypotheses in glass beakers in the back rooms of borrowed houses. His first success was a photographic paper. He called it Velox. It was the first paper that could be developed by artificial light, which meant that ordinary people could print photographs at home in the evening rather than in daylight in the morning. In 1900, he sold Velox, and the small company that produced it to George Eastman of the Eastman Kodak Company. The sum was widely reported as $750,000. In today's money, it is the equivalent of more than $27 million. It was the kind of payday that would have allowed most men to stop. Leo Baekeland used it as the seed capital for 7 years of obsessive experimentation in a converted carriage house behind his estate at Snug Rock, on a hill overlooking the Hudson River north of New York City. He was looking for a synthetic substitute for shellac. Shellac was the resin secreted by an insect in India and used in 1905 for almost every electrical insulator in the world. The telephone industry was growing. The electrical industry was growing. The supply of insect shellac could not grow with them. Whoever invented a synthetic replacement would, in a sense, own the inside of every device of the next century. On the 14th of July, 1907, in his laboratory at Snug Rock, Leo Baekeland succeeded. He combined phenol and formaldehyde in a sealed iron pressure vessel of his own design. He applied heat. He applied pressure. He cooled the result. He held in his hand a hard, smooth, dark amber substance that could be molded when warm, that held its shape when cool, that did not conduct electricity, that did not melt in normal heat, that did not react to acids or solvents, and that had never existed in nature. He had invented the first fully synthetic plastic. He called it Bakelite. The world took it within months. Western Electric used Bakelite for telephone handsets. General Electric used it for switch plates. The auto industry used it for distributor caps. By 1910, he had founded the General Bakelite Company. By 1922, it had merged with 2 competitors into the Bakelite Corporation. By 1939, when Leo was 75 and had decided to retire, the Bakelite Corporation was sold to the Union Carbide and Carbon Corporation for stock valued at approximately $15 million at the time. In today's money, it is the equivalent of more than $300 million. The Baekelands, who had arrived in America as immigrants, were now one of the wealthier industrial families in the country. Leo himself, in his last years, became the first Baekeland recluse. He retreated to his estate in Coconut Grove, Florida. He ate canned food because he had developed a suspicion of fresh ingredients. He refused to spend his own money. He wandered the grounds in a faded coat. He died in 1944 at the age of 80. The fortune passed to his son. The son was George Washington Baekeland, an engineer with none of his father's drive. George married a woman from the Hallowell family, had children, managed the family money badly, but with enough cushion that the management did not show. George took his own life in 1966. George's son was Brooks. Brooks was born in 1920. By the time he reached his early 20s, Brooks had absorbed a particular lesson from 3 generations of Bakeland history. The lesson was that the family had already done the hard work. The lesson was that he, the great-grandson of the immigrant chemist, was not required to invent or to build or even to manage. He was required only to inherit, to occupy his life with intelligent occupations of his own choosing, and to pass the fortune onward. He chose to be a writer. He chose to be an explorer. He chose to be a pilot. He flew small planes in the Second World War. He climbed in the Andes. He corresponded with the explorer Peter Matthiessen and the writer Romain Gary. He almost never finished a manuscript. He almost never published. He lived on the inherited income from the trusts that had been set up out of his grandfather's Union Carbide stock, supplemented by lump payments as the older generation died. He did not need to work. He did not, except in the most rarefied sense of writing letters and keeping notebooks, do any. By 1942, he was 22, handsome in a long-faced Anglo-Saxon way, available, and exactly the kind of man a beautiful girl from a small hotel suite in New York could plausibly catch. Barbara caught him in California. She caught him by telling him she was pregnant when she was not. The marriage took place quickly, with very little ceremony, before anyone could examine the situation closely. Chapter 3. The Marriage That Looked Like a Magazine. In 1942, in California, a girl with no name married a man with a name that belonged to half the telephones in America. The wedding was small, the honeymoon was brief. The young couple returned almost immediately to the East Coast, took an apartment in New York, and began the long construction of the public version of themselves. Barbara, in the marriage register, listed her profession as painter. Brooks, in the same register, listed his as writer. Both descriptions were aspirations rather than accurate accounts of how they spent their days. Neither would ever earn a meaningful sum from the activity they had named. Neither needed to. They took an apartment in a brownstone at 71 East 71st Street, between Park and Madison, on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. It was the right address. It was not the most expensive address in the city, but it was the right one, the one that announced to other people who knew the streets that the people inside the apartment had taste. They furnished it slowly and with discipline. 18th century French chairs that Barbara found in a small dealer's shop near Madison Avenue, old silver from Brooks's grandmother, a pair of crystal chandeliers that Barbara hung even in rooms that did not need them, because she had decided early that crystal in unexpected rooms was the kind of detail people remembered. The dining room held a long mahogany table that could seat 14. Barbara set it for 10 as a rule. She believed, on instinct she had developed by watching other hostesses, that 10 was the optimal number for the kind of evening she wanted. 6 was a dinner, 12 was a function, 10 was a salon. She began to make the salon work. She wrote letters of introduction in elegant handwriting on heavy stationery to writers and painters and editors she had not yet met, but had heard described. She invited them to drinks. She introduced them to one another. She fed them small, expensive dinners that she had planned with the cook the night before, course by course. She kept her own voice low. She let the famous guests talk. She asked the right questions. Within 5 years, the salon was working. Greta Garbo came when she was in town, which was rarely. Tennessee Williams came regularly, drank too much, and stayed late. William Styron sent his wife Rose ahead of him to thank Barbara for the invitation. Gore Vidal came once. The painter Salvador Dali, when he was passing through New York on the way back to Spain, was a guest at least twice, and Barbara would tell people for the rest of her life that he had asked to paint her portrait, which he had not. But the story was good enough that no one corrected it. She had done it. The girl from the Delmonico had become the hostess at 71st Street. The wife of Brooks Baekeland was now, for a particular kind of New Yorker who cared about which dinners mattered, a name worth remembering. She did not relax. She had not been built for relaxation. She intensified. She began a parallel European life. From the summer of 1954 onward, with the small son she now had aged 8, the family migrated. They rented villas. They took suites. They took 20 trunks. The seasons followed a pattern. New York in the autumn, Christmas at Klosters, in the Swiss Alps in the company of literary skiers, spring in Rome at the Hotel Lancaster, summer at Cap d'Antibes on the French Riviera, Italy in late summer for the Venice Film Festival, autumn back in New York. Each rented house she organized within hours of arrival. Each rented house she filled within days, with the small bowl of fresh flowers in every bedroom, the chilled bottles in the icebox, the books on the table that suggested the household was reading. She was photographed. She was photographed by Cecil Beaton in 1955, leaning on a balcony in Antibes in a white shirt with the sleeves rolled. She was painted by the Italian society portraitist Alejo Vidal Quadras. She showed her own paintings at small exhibitions, first in New York and then in Rome, where the dealers were polite. The paintings were competent. They were not memorable. The exhibition sold a few canvases each, mostly to friends. Barbara was not a great painter. She was a great hostess. She had not learned the difference between the two and did not want to. The price of all of this was that Brooks was disengaged. He attended the dinners when he was in town. He traveled when he was not. He had affairs that he barely concealed, with women in Rome and Paris, and once with a married friend of Barbara's in New York. Barbara found out about each in its turn, and either ignored it or retaliated with a quiet affair of her own. The marriage, before the son was 3, was already a structure of mutual performance held together by the wealth, and by the apartment, and by the salon, and by the child. The child was the centerpiece. The child was the heir. The child was the small, beautiful object that Barbara had given Brooks, in exchange for which Brooks had given her his name. The child, in Barbara's mind, was the reason the structure could not be allowed to fall. He was born on the 28th of August, 1946, at a hospital in New York. He was named Anthony Daly Baekeland. They called him Tony. His mother, leaning over the bassinet at the hospital, told the friend who had come to visit that she had never, in her entire life, seen anything as beautiful. Chapter 4. The Child Who Was Already an Exhibit. From the moment Tony Baekeland was old enough to be photographed, his mother began curating him. She dressed him as if he were the small product of a couture house. She had a tailor in New York who made his clothes for him, beginning at age 3. Small linen jackets, small wool shorts, small white shirts, small leather shoes. She had his hair cut once a month, in a particular short style that emphasized his eyes. She walked him in Central Park in the autumn, in clothes that other women turned to look at. She brought him to her dinner parties when he was 5, 6, 7 years old, after his bath, in a clean white shirt, and she walked him along the line of guests to be admired before he was sent to bed. The guests admired him. He was, by every photograph and every later testimony, an extraordinarily beautiful child. He had blonde hair, blue eyes, a fine boned face, and a quiet seriousness that adults found enchanting. Tennessee Williams told Barbara that the boy was the most interesting 6-year-old he had ever met. The Italian portrait painter Vidal Quadras asked permission to sketch him. The photographer who shot Barbara for Town and Country in 1953 asked, while he was there, whether he could photograph Tony as well. He could. He did. The boy appeared briefly in a fashion spread on the Children of the International set, age 7, in a small jacket that matched his mother's gown. Barbara loved him with a totality that even her closest friends found unnerving. She told people, throughout his childhood, that he was the most important thing she had ever done. She told him the same thing, in the same words. Often, other women noticed. The relationship was, even at 7 and 8 years old, more concentrated than the relationships those women had with their own children. Barbara did not put Tony in another room when adult conversation began. Barbara did not send Tony out of the apartment when an interesting guest arrived. Barbara kept Tony close. Barbara consulted Tony while he was still in short trousers on the menus and on the seating plans. He grew up inside the salon. By the age of 9, he could distinguish between a Bordeaux and a Burgundy from across the room. By the age of 10, he could identify the perfume of every regular guest. By the age of 11, he had heard 1,000 stories about people he would never meet and had absorbed, with the perfect retentive memory of an only child, the rules of an adult world he had no business in. He was being prepared for nothing in particular. He was being prepared, in effect, to be a perpetual ornament in the room his mother was constructing. In 1954, when Tony was 8, the family began the seasonal migration to Europe. He was withdrawn from his New York school, enrolled in a Swiss boarding school for the autumn term, withdrawn from that one in winter, taken to Klosters, taken to Rome in the spring, taken to Antibes in the summer, returned to New York in time for Barbara to give the autumn dinner. The pattern would continue, with variations, for the next 10 years. He attended 7 different schools by the time he was 16, in 4 countries, in 3 languages. He was expelled from most of them. He learned in each new school that he would be removed before he had time to make any real friend. And so, he gradually stopped trying. The first overt sign of mental illness appeared when he was 13 or 14. a school nurse at a Swiss institution outside Lausanne, contacted Barbara to say that her son had told her, in calm circumstances, that he could hear his dead grandfather speaking to him. The grandfather in question was George Baekeland, Brooks's father, who at that point was still alive, but who would take his own life 2 years later. Tony described the conversations as helpful and friendly. He said the grandfather gave him advice about other people. The nurse, who had been trained in a country that took such things seriously, said the boy should be seen by a psychiatrist immediately. Barbara declined. She withdrew Tony from the school. She told friends on the journey to the next rented house that the Swiss were stuffy provincials with no understanding of what an unusual boy actually required. She told Tony, more quietly, in his bedroom at the new house, that he should keep things like that between the two of them. The school expulsions accelerated. He was thrown out of an English school for setting fires in the dormitory. He was withdrawn from a French school after he stopped speaking for a week. He was sent to a sanatorium briefly in Switzerland and removed within 10 days because Barbara had decided the doctors were patronizing. He was sent to live with his grandmother Nini in New York for 1 school year, and Nini, who loved him, found that she could not handle him alone. By the time he was 16, the Baekelands had stopped trying to keep him in formal education. He was permitted instead to travel with his mother, to paint, to write, to read, and to be presented at her dinner parties as a young artist of unusual promise. The arrangement suited Barbara because it meant he was never far from her. The arrangement did not suit Tony because it meant he was never given the only thing he had any chance of using, the structure of an institution outside the family. He drew constantly. He drew eyes. He drew knives. He drew floating limbs. He filled notebook after notebook in a precise, controlled, slightly mechanical hand. He gave the notebooks to his mother. His mother put them in a drawer and told friends with pride that her son was producing remarkable material. She did not show the friends the drawings of the knives. At 17, in the summer of 1963, in a rented villa in Anhedonia on the Italian coast, Tony asked his mother whether she thought he might be losing his mind. Barbara, by the later account of a friend who was present in the next room, told him that he was an artist and that artists felt things ordinary people did not feel, and that what he was experiencing was a gift. She told him not to mention it to his father. She told him not to mention it to a doctor. She kissed him on the forehead. She poured herself another drink. The friend in the next room heard the whole exchange and did not, by her own later admission, do anything about it. Chapter 5. The Father Who Was Never There. Brooks Baekeland had inherited the right to be cold, and he exercised that right with discipline. He had been a Second World War fighter pilot. The war was, by his own description in later years, the only period in his life when he had felt himself to be useful in a way other people could measure. After the war, he had returned to New York, married Barbara, taken his place in the apartment at 71st Street, and discovered that he had no idea what to do with himself for the next 40 years. The family fortune, which had once required Leo to invent and George to mismanage, now required Brooks only to occupy. He did not want to occupy. He wanted to do something. He could not decide what. He chose eventually to be a writer. The choice was sincere in its way. He had read widely. He had a vocabulary. He had opinions about Conrad and Hardy and Dostoevsky. He kept notebooks, beautiful leather notebooks bought in Rome, filled with elegant cursive observations about landscapes and women and other writers. He produced, over the course of 3 decades of effort, almost no published work. He started a novel about a man who lived alone in the Andes. He started a memoir about flying. He started essays on the nature of solitude. He finished at most 3 or 4 short articles for small magazines. He compensated, as a certain kind of man does, by being more contemptuous of other people's work than his own absence of work could justify. He told Barbara, in front of guests, that her paintings were the productions of a bored housewife. He told her, in private, that her dinners were vulgar. He told friends behind her back that she was a peasant who had trapped him with the false pregnancy in California, and that he had stayed for the boy. He was, on the evidence of nearly every witness in Savage Grace, a man who used his intelligence as a weapon. He was funny. He was cruel. He was perfectly capable of producing at the dinner table a paragraph of pure conversational beauty that would humiliate his wife without naming her. He did this often. He did it in the presence of Tony from the time Tony was 5 years old. He was also, throughout the marriage, almost continuously unfaithful. He had a long affair with a married woman in Rome that lasted on and off for 6 years. He had a shorter, more public affair with a friend of Barbara's in New York that broke up the friend's marriage and that Barbara was the last to be told about. He had a series of brief involvements during his long absences in South America. He told himself, in the notebooks, that he was a free spirit who had outgrown bourgeois sexual convention. He told Barbara, when she found out, that she had brought it on herself by being possessive. Barbara responded, eventually, by taking a lover of her own. The lover was Samuel Adams Green, a young museum curator who had come into the Bakeland circle through a writer friend. Sam Green was bright, sociable, well-connected, and homosexual. The affair, which lasted in various intensities for almost 10 years, was for Barbara less about physical love than about having someone who admired her work, listened to her stories, and accompanied her to openings. Sam Green became, in the late 1950s and early 1960s, the closest thing Barbara had to a friend. He was also, by his own later account, one of the first people in the Bakeland circle to notice that Tony was very ill. The household by 1960 was a structure of 2 adults occupying the same expensive rooms while leading nearly separate lives. Brooks was away for months at a time. Barbara stayed in New York or Rome or Paris with Tony and Sam Green. Letters were exchanged, photographs were taken. The seasonal migration continued. The dinners continued. To anyone reading the society pages, the Bakelands of 71st Street were a brilliant cosmopolitan family. To anyone close enough to be at the dinners, they were a family in which the parents communicated mostly through the son. Tony, by the time he was 14, understood the situation completely. He was the load-bearing wall. He was the reason the marriage could not be ended without the kind of administrative collapse that neither parent wanted to face. He was the small, beautiful object whose presence at the long mahogany table allowed the long mahogany table to continue to be set for 10. He responded the way an intelligent and unstable adolescent would. He charmed everyone at the dinners. He sat between the famous guests. He memorized compliments. He produced after each dinner a little drawing of one of the guests, which Barbara would have framed and would hang in the hallway. He also began, in the privacy of the small bedroom in whichever apartment they were currently in, to talk to himself for hours. The conversations were elaborate. They were heard on multiple occasions by housekeepers and by overnight guests. The participants in the conversations were the dead grandfather, occasionally a dead aunt, and, increasingly, a figure Tony described as the angel. The angel was, by Tony's own description in later notebooks, a tall, pale, beautiful young man with white wings who lived in the corner of every room. The angel told Tony what to think. The angel approved or disapproved of the people who came to the dinners. The angel had told Tony, by the time he was 16, several specific things about his mother. The angel had told him that his mother loved him more than was natural. The angel had told him that his father was going to leave. The angel had told him that he, Tony, was very special, and that he would be required at some point in the future to perform a difficult act. Tony did not tell his mother about the angel. He had learned the lesson she had given him at 17 in Anhedonia. He kept it between the two of them, or rather, between himself and the corner of the room. Chapter 6. The Woman Who Took Brooks from His Own Son. In 1967, a young Australian woman walked into the Bakeland circle to meet the son, and the father took her instead. Her name was Sylvie. She was 24 years old. She had been introduced to the family by a mutual friend who thought that an intelligent, attractive young woman with no particular agenda might be a useful presence around Tony, who was then 21, beautiful, unstable, and showing every sign of being a young man who needed at least the appearance of a girlfriend. Sylvie agreed to be that appearance. She came to dinners. She accompanied Tony to galleries. She went with him on long walks along the Seine when the family was in Paris. She was patient with his silences. She was, by her own later account in Savage Grace, charmed by him in a way that did not require romantic intensity. The way one is charmed by a clever and damaged younger brother. Brooks observed all of this. He was 47 years old. He was at the age common in privileged men of his particular type, when the realization that life has not provided the meaning it promised begins to demand a violent corrective. He looked at Sylvie. He decided he wanted her. The decision was not concealed. He began, within weeks of meeting her, to engineer occasions when he and Sylvie would be alone. He took her to lunch under the pretense of discussing his son. He took her to a small art gallery in Paris under the pretense of asking her advice. He took her eventually to a hotel. The affair began in the late autumn of 1967. Tony was 21, Brooks was 47. Barbara, in London at the time, did not yet know. The depth of the cruelty has been argued about by the people who lived through it for the rest of their lives. Some defended Brooks on the grounds that Sylvie was an adult who had made her own choice. Others, including most of the women in the circle, regarded what he had done as one of the more contemptible acts they had ever seen a father commit. The most damning judgment came from Sam Green, who had observed the family for 15 years, and who said in an interview years later that what Brooks had done was not simply an affair. It was the surgical removal of the only thing that had given his son the appearance of a future. Barbara learned the truth in February of 1968. She was in London, alone, at the rented penthouse on Cadogan Square. A friend, with the particular cruelty of a friend who feels the duty to inform, telephoned her from Paris and explained in delicate language what was happening between her husband and the young woman who was supposed to have been their son's possible girlfriend. Barbara hung up the telephone. She walked to the bathroom of the rented penthouse. She poured herself a glass of water. She opened the medicine cabinet. She took, by the later medical reconstruction, between 40 and 60 barbiturate tablets, washed down with the water. She lay down on the bed in her clothes. She closed her eyes. She survived because Gloria Jones, the wife of the novelist James Jones, who happened to be in London for the week and had been planning to come for dinner that evening, arrived at the apartment, was not admitted by the housekeeper, knew Barbara's habits well enough to insist, was let in, walked to the bedroom, saw Barbara, and called an ambulance. Barbara had her stomach pumped at a London hospital. She survived. She returned to the Cadogan Square apartment within the week. She wrote Brooks a letter. The letter, by accounts from those who saw it, was 28 pages long. It described in careful sequence every cruelty he had committed during the marriage, every infidelity she knew about, every slight at every dinner. It ended with the announcement that she would not be granting him a divorce. She would, she said, fight him in every court on 3 continents. She would name Sylvie in every newspaper. She would destroy the careful private life he had constructed around the affair. Brooks read the letter. He filed for divorce anyway. The divorce was granted after 18 months of negotiation, in 1968. The settlement was financially adequate by ordinary standards and devastating by the standards of the life Barbara had spent 26 years constructing. She received an annual payment that varied, by source, between $25,000 and $40,000 in 1960s money, the right to occupy the Cadogan Square apartment, and a small lump sum to cover legal expenses. The bulk of the income from the trusts remained with Brooks. Tony, as the only heir, was the named beneficiary of a separate trust, whose principal he could not touch until certain older Bakelands had died. Brooks moved in with Sylvie. He married her within the year. They moved to Brittany, on the western coast of France, into a stone house on a hill overlooking the sea. They had a son. Brooks lived in that stone house with Sylvie for the remaining 39 years of his life. He returned to Paris occasionally. He returned to London almost never. He did not see Tony again after 1968 in any sustained way. He did not see Barbara again at all. The cage door had closed. Barbara was alone in the penthouse at Cadogan Square. Tony was 22 years old, paranoid schizophrenic, in love with a man his father had taken, and now, by default, the only person his mother had left to love. She held on to him with both hands. Chapter 7. The Summer in Mallorca That Nobody Forgave. The first summer after Brooks left, mother and son disappeared into a rented house above the sea in Mallorca. The house was a finca in the hills above Cala Sant Vicens, on the northern coast of the island, with whitewashed walls, terracotta floors, a deep stone terrace, and a view across the Mediterranean toward the mainland of Spain. They took it for 3 months. They brought a single housekeeper. They brought a stack of books and a case of wine and several large suitcases. They told the friends in London they would be back in September. What happened in that house between June and September of 1968 has been described, contested, and recovered from witness testimony for more than 50 years. Some of it is documented, some of it is rumor, some of it is the kind of half-memory that the people who were there developed when they tried, decades later, to explain something that had unsettled them at the time. The documented part is straightforward. Barbara, who had nearly died in February, who had received a divorce decree she had not wanted, who had no husband and no clear identity outside the marriage that had defined her for 26 years, brought her 21-year-old son to a remote rented house and lived with him there in conditions of unusual intensity. She drank. She painted. She wrote long letters to friends in New York and London. She gave small dinners on the terrace for friends who came to visit, including the writer Heather Cohane and the curator Sam Green, both of whom would later testify to Robbins and Aronson about what they had seen. The contested part begins with what those visitors observed. They observed candlelit dinners for two on the terrace at which the mother and son sat at opposite ends of a small table and looked at each other in a way that was not, by any natural interpretation, the way a mother and son look at each other. They observed Barbara emerging from Tony's bedroom in the morning in a dressing gown. They observed Tony emerging from Barbara's bedroom on other mornings, also in a dressing gown. They observed the housekeeper, a Spanish woman of about 60, making the sign of the cross and refusing to comment. The witnesses, when they were asked to put what they had seen into words, struggled. Some of them said directly that they believed Barbara had begun a sexual relationship with her son. Heather Cohane, in particular, in her testimony to Aronson, was unambiguous. She said she had no doubt. Others, including Sam Green, who had known Barbara longer than almost anyone, took the opposite view. Green said in his interview that he did not believe the incest had actually occurred. He said that Barbara, by that summer, had become so wounded and so theatrical that she was capable of staging the appearance of any taboo for the purpose of shocking the friends she suspected of pitying her. He said the candlelit dinners were performance. He said the dressing gowns were performance. He said the whole summer was a long, elaborate, half-deliberate provocation to a world she felt had abandoned her. Tony himself, after the murder, told a London psychiatrist that he and his mother had been physically intimate in Mallorca that summer and on later occasions. The psychiatrist recorded the statement. Tony repeated it to the police in 1972. He also repeated it, in a calmer mood, to a friend who visited him at Broadmoor. He said it with the matter-of-fact tone of someone describing a long-established fact, rather than someone confessing. The truth has never been settled. The careful position, which is the one the major book and the major film both take, is to record both the testimony and the contradictions, and to let the reader reach a verdict. The blunter position is to observe that whatever physically happened between mother and son that summer, the relationship had become something other than a mother and son. Relationship in any of the senses the words ordinarily carry. They had moved into a space that had no name. They had crossed in the absence of any other restraining structure into the kind of attachment that two damaged people develop when they are the only people available to each other, and when the world outside has stopped paying attention. In September, they returned to London. They moved back into the penthouse at Cadogan Square. They lived there together, with periodic visits from Sam Green and from various house guests, for the next 4.5 years. The penthouse occupied the top floor of a large red brick mansion block on the south side of Cadogan Square in Chelsea. It had high ceilings, 3 bedrooms, a long drawing room with a view across the leafy private garden of the square, a small library, a dining room, a kitchen, and 2 staff rooms. It was the kind of London apartment that announced, the moment a visitor stepped out of the lift into the private hallway, that the people inside had been able to afford their lives for a long time. Inside the apartment, a different fact announced itself within minutes. The drinks tray in the drawing room was rarely down to fewer than 4 open bottles. The ashtrays were full. The smell of cannabis hung in Tony's bedroom in the evenings. Books lay open on the floor where they had been dropped. Tony's drawings, which had grown larger and more violent, were tacked to the walls of his bedroom in overlapping layers. Barbara's paintings, which had grown more abstract and more agitated, hung in the drawing room next to the inherited French chairs. She still gave the occasional dinner party. She still wrote elegant invitations on heavy stationery. She still set the table for 10 when she had 10 coming. But the guests had thinned. The famous faces from New York rarely passed through. The English aristocrats who had once accepted her invitations now made excuses. The smaller circle that remained was made of the kind of people who attend such dinners out of long curiosity about what is happening inside the apartment, rather than for the pleasure of the company. What was happening inside the apartment was the slow strangulation of 2 people by each other. Chapter 8. the psychiatrists nobody listened to. 3 different doctors looked at Tony Baekeland between 1969 and 1972 and said the same sentence in different words. The sentence, stripped of its medical politeness, was that Anthony Baekeland was suffering from paranoid schizophrenia, that his condition was severe, that he was at significant risk of violence, particularly toward his mother, and that he required sustained inpatient psychiatric care of a kind that would have to last months, possibly years, in order to stabilize him on the available medication. The first doctor who said this, in a confidential consultation in London in the spring of 1969, was a Harley Street psychiatrist whose name has been preserved in private correspondence rather than in the public record. He saw Tony twice. He wrote to Barbara afterwards. He recommended a 6-month minimum admission to a private psychiatric clinic in the home counties outside London. Barbara read the letter. She wrote a polite reply thanking the doctor for his concern. She did not follow the recommendation. She told a friend in Paris the same week that English doctors were timid and unimaginative, and that Tony required, instead, a long restorative summer in the south of France. The second doctor, in 1970, was attached to a small private psychiatric hospital in Surrey, to which Tony had briefly been admitted after a particularly difficult evening at Cadogan Square. He kept Tony for 11 days. He stabilized him on a phenolphthalein medication. He told Barbara, when she came to collect him, that he should remain in residence for a further 3 months and then transition gradually to outpatient care under supervision. Barbara nodded. She signed the discharge papers. She drove Tony back to London the same afternoon. He was off the medication within 10 days. The third doctor, the one whose warning would become famous after the murder, was Dr. Lindsay Jacobs, a Hampstead psychiatrist who saw Tony in the autumn of 1972. By that point, Tony had already, in July of the same year, twice attempted to harm his mother. He had, in mid-July, tried to push her into the traffic on Pont Street as they walked back from a restaurant. Barbara had laughed it off to friends as a clumsy gesture. He had, 2 weeks later, attacked her in the kitchen at Cadogan Square with a kitchen knife, slashing her on the arm before a male house guest pulled him off. Barbara had taken him to a London hospital. He had been admitted overnight. He had been released the next day on Barbara's signature. Dr. Jacobs saw Tony for the first time in early October 1972. He saw him for 4 sessions over the next 3 weeks. After the 4th session, he telephoned Barbara at the Cadogan Square apartment. He asked her to come to his consulting rooms the following morning. She came. He told her, in plain words, what he had observed. He told her that her son was actively psychotic. He told her that the recent attacks were not isolated. He told her that the pattern of behavior was, in his clinical judgment, escalating. He told her, in a sentence Tony himself remembered hearing the doctor say in an earlier session, that he believed her son was likely to attempt to kill her, and that she should not, under any circumstances, continue to live with him alone. Barbara, by Tony's own later recollection of the conversation, replied, "I know, he is my son." The doctor pressed her. He offered to make immediate arrangements for an admission to a secure psychiatric facility. He offered to write the letters. He offered to handle the practicalities. Barbara declined. She told him she would think about it. She thanked him. She walked out of his consulting rooms in Hampstead, took a taxi back to Cadogan Square, and resumed the life she had been living. The position she took in the weeks between Dr. Jacobs' warning and her death was a position that has been argued about ever since. The kind interpretation is that she was a woman so exhausted by 20 years of caring for an ill son and so terrified of being separated from the only human being who still depended on her that she could not bring herself to take an action that would have meant living, possibly for the rest of her life, alone. The harsh interpretation is that she had become, by that point, so addicted to the drama and so committed to the version of herself in which she was a beautiful suffering mother of a beautiful suffering son that she could not voluntarily end that drama, even at the cost of her own life. The honest interpretation is probably that both readings were true at once. She had also begun, in those weeks, to keep a knife on her bedside table. The knife was a small, sharp paring knife from the kitchen. She had taken it from the drawer in early November and placed it on the bedside table, half hidden behind a glass of water. She had explained to the housekeeper, who had asked, that she wanted it there in case she needed to defend herself. She had not removed the kitchen knives from the kitchen. She had not asked Tony to leave the apartment. She had not asked anyone else to come and stay. She had not signed the papers Dr. Jacobs had offered. She had placed one small paring knife on her bedside table and had told the housekeeper that it was for self-defense. Tony knew the knife was there. He noticed it the first night. He never mentioned it. He did, in his notebooks that autumn, draw the knife several times. In the second week of November 1972, the angel that Tony had been hearing for years in the corner of his bedroom told him something specific. The angel told him, in the calm and certain voice that Tony was by then accustomed to, that the difficult act would happen soon. The angel did not say when. The angel did not say where. The angel did not say that the act was wrong. The angel said only that it would happen soon, and that Tony would know the moment. The moment came on the 17th of November, in the kitchen, just after lunch. Chapter 9. The Knife in the Kitchen. On a Friday afternoon. On Friday, the 17th of November, 1972, Barbara Baekeland came home for lunch. It was a cold London day, gray and damp, with a low ceiling of cloud over Sloane Square. She had been out that morning to a small lunch at the apartment of an English friend a few streets away. She had come home in a taxi at approximately 1:15 in the afternoon. She had let herself into the apartment building, taken the lift to the top floor, stepped out into the small private vestibule, unlocked her own door, and walked into the entry hall of the penthouse. She was wearing a green dress. The dress was, by the later description of the responding constable, the kind of dress that looked expensive even to a man whose ordinary frame of reference for women's clothing was the catalogs of Marks and Spencer. It was a long-sleeved silk dress in a deep green, with a small cinched waist and a calf-length skirt. She was wearing dark stockings and low heels. She had a small string of pearls at her throat. She had put on a careful but light face for the lunch. She was, at 51, still a beautiful woman. Tony was in the kitchen. He had been in the kitchen for approximately an hour. He was making, or perhaps had been intending to make, an omelet. There was a small pile of chopped onion on the wooden board on the counter. There was a single beaten egg in a bowl. There was a small puddle of milk on the surface of the counter where the bottle had been opened too quickly. There was a large kitchen knife on the board, the one he had used to chop the onion. What exactly was said between mother and son in the next 8 to 10 minutes has never been established with certainty. The reconstruction, drawn from Tony's later statements to police and to his Broadmoor psychiatrists, suggests an argument that began about food. He had, by his own account, been trying to make himself lunch. She had come in, asked him what he was doing, looked at the mess on the counter, and said something dismissive. He had answered. She had answered back. The argument escalated, with the particular speed of arguments between two people who have been having the same argument for 4.5 years. At some point in the argument, by Tony's account, Barbara mentioned Brooks. By Tony's account, she said something to the effect that Brooks had been right about him. By Tony's account, she said that he was useless, that he was a burden, that she should have listened to the doctors. By Tony's account, the angel in the corner of the kitchen, who had been waiting since the second week of November, told him, in the calm voice he had grown used to, that this was the moment. Tony picked up the knife from the board. He took 2 steps. He drove the knife, with the full weight of his upper body behind it, into his mother's chest. The blade entered between the ribs on the left side. It penetrated the chest wall. It passed through the upper lobe of the left lung. It pierced the wall of the left ventricle of her heart. She did not, by the later forensic reconstruction, scream. She made a small sound. She put her hand to her chest. She looked at him with what the pathologist described on the basis of the position in which the body was found, as an expression more of surprise than of pain. She took 2 unsteady steps backward. Her low heel caught on the threshold between the kitchen and the small adjoining pantry. She fell. She landed on her back on the linoleum of the kitchen floor. Within 45 seconds, her heart had stopped pumping blood. Within 90 seconds, the brain had begun to die. Tony stood over her. By his own later account, he watched. He did not, by his own account, feel anything in particular for the first minute or so. He was aware that something significant had happened. He was aware that his mother was on the floor. He was aware that the angel in the corner of the kitchen had, almost as soon as the act was completed, gone quiet. He stepped over the body. He walked through the dining room. He walked through the drawing room. He sat down on the small low table by the telephone in the hallway. He picked up the receiver. He dialed the number of a small Chinese restaurant on King's Road that he had used several times. The proprietor answered. Tony, in the calm and pleasant tone he was capable of producing when he was on medication, placed an order. The order, by the later police record, was for sweet and sour pork, fried rice, and a side dish of vegetables. He gave the address of the Cadogan Square apartment. He gave the floor number. He said he would pay in cash on delivery. He asked the proprietor to send the food as quickly as possible because he was hungry. He hung up the telephone. He walked back to the kitchen. He looked at his mother again. He turned. He walked into the drawing room. He sat down on the sofa. He picked up a book from the side table. The book, by the later police inventory of the apartment, was a hardback copy of a recently published collection of Robert Lowell's poems. He opened it. He waited for the Chinese food. It was the housekeeper, returning to the apartment at approximately 2:30 in the afternoon, after her own lunch break, who found the body. She walked into the kitchen, saw Barbara on the floor, screamed, ran into the drawing room, found Tony reading on the sofa, asked him what had happened, received no clear answer, and ran from the apartment to the porter's desk in the lobby. The porter telephoned the police. The first officers from the Metropolitan Police arrived at Cadogan Square at approximately 2:45. They entered the apartment. They found Barbara on the kitchen floor, exactly as the housekeeper had described. They found Tony on the sofa in the drawing room, the Lowell poems open in his lap. They asked him whether he was Anthony Baekeland. He said he was. They asked him whether he had done this. He said he had. They asked him whether he understood what he had done. He said he did. The Chinese delivery man arrived at approximately 3 o'clock with the order and a small handwritten bill. The officers paid him in cash from the petty cash Barbara kept in a drawer in the hallway. They tipped him. They sent him away. They closed the door. They placed Tony under arrest. Barbara Daly Baekeland was pronounced dead at the scene at 3:12 in the afternoon by the police surgeon. Cause of death: a single stab wound to the heart. Murder weapon: a kitchen knife, recovered from the kitchen floor, approximately 1 meter from the body, where Tony had dropped it before walking to the telephone. Chapter 10: The Old Bailey and the Asylum. On the Hill. In June 1973, the surviving Baekeland heir stood in the dock at the Central Criminal Court of London. The trial took place at the Old Bailey, the same building that had heard the cases of Dr. Crippen and the Crays and 1,000 other defendants in 1,000 other dramas. The defendant was Anthony Daly Baekeland, age 26, of 81 Cadogan Square. The charge was murder. The defense counsel was John Mortimer, an experienced barrister and a writer in his own right, who would, a few years later, create the fictional Horace Rumpole on the back of cases like this one. The defense was diminished responsibility on the grounds of paranoid schizophrenia. The prosecution did not contest the medical evidence. The pathology of the killing was undisputed. The single deep stab wound, the kitchen knife, the position of the body, the absence of any prior physical altercation in the immediate moments before the strike, the defendant's own clear admission to police at the scene. The prosecution's case, presented with restraint, was simply that the killing had occurred. The medical case, presented by 3 psychiatrists for the defense, was that the defendant had been suffering from active paranoid schizophrenia for at least 6 years prior to the act, that he had been hallucinating consistently throughout that period, that he had on multiple recent occasions attempted to harm his mother, that one psychiatrist had warned the mother in writing of the danger, and that the act itself had been committed in the course of a psychotic episode, triggered by an ordinary domestic argument. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. They returned a verdict of not guilty of murder, guilty of manslaughter by reason of diminished responsibility. The judge, on the basis of the medical evidence, ordered Tony Baekeland to be detained at Broadmoor Hospital under Section 65 of the Mental Health Act, with a restriction order of unlimited duration. The detention would continue, the order specified, until the Home Secretary was satisfied that the patient could safely be released to the community. Tony was driven to Broadmoor in a closed van the following morning. Broadmoor was and is a high-security psychiatric hospital located on a hill in Crowthorne, in Berkshire, about 30 miles west of London. It had been built in the 1860s to house mentally ill criminal offenders. By 1973, it was a sprawling Victorian institution behind a high wall, with wards arranged around a series of courtyards, a chapel, a workshop, a hospital garden, and a staff village outside the gates. It held, at the time of Tony's admission, approximately 500 patients. They included a former member of Parliament, several poisoners, a small number of cannibals, and a great many men and women whose stories had not made the newspapers. Tony Baekeland's story had made the newspapers. He arrived as a minor celebrity. He was 26 years old, fine-boned, blonde, articulate, and the heir to one of the great American industrial fortunes. He was assigned to a ward for what the hospital called the upper category of patient, those whose violence had been demonstrated, but whose general intelligence and behavior made them comparatively easy to manage. He was given a small private room with a bed, a chair, a desk, a window, and a bell. He was issued the standard Broadmoor uniform of dark trousers and a soft shirt. He settled in. He began almost at once to receive visitors. The visitor logs at Broadmoor for the years 1973 to 1980 contain an extraordinary list of names. The actress Patricia Neal came twice. The photographer Cecil Beaton came once and noted in his diary that the young man seemed gentler than he had imagined. The novelist James Jones and his wife Gloria, the same Gloria who had saved Barbara's life in 1968, came together for an afternoon. Heather Cohane came. The American writer Mary McCarthy passed through one afternoon when she was lecturing in London. Various younger friends from the international set, the kind of people who had eaten at Barbara's dinners as students or as junior journalists, and who now wanted, out of a mixture of guilt and morbid curiosity, to see what had become of her son, made the trip from London by train and taxi. Tony, on these visits, was charming. He was articulate. He spoke about his painting, his reading, his current project of a long memoir in verse. He spoke about his mother in two distinct registers. In one register, which surfaced when the visitor was sympathetic to Barbara, Tony described her as a saint, a beautiful woman who had given him everything, the only person who had ever truly loved him. In the other register, which surfaced when the visitor was skeptical of Barbara, Tony described her as a witch, a controlling and devouring presence who had ruined his life, and from whom the act of November 1972 had been a kind of necessary liberation. He could pass between the two registers within the same visit. He did not seem to notice that he was doing it. He worked in the handicrafts shop. He produced small leather bookbindings, small wooden boxes, small painted miniatures, which the hospital sold at modest prices in a Christmas fair every December. He had relationships with two other male patients during his time at Broadmoor, both of them passing involvements rather than sustained partnerships. He took his medication. He kept his room neat. He wrote letters in long, elegant handwriting to a circle of correspondence on the outside. He was, in the language of the hospital reports, a model patient. By 1978, the staff psychiatrists were noting that his hallucinations had largely ceased, that he reported no further visits from the angel, that he had developed insight into his condition and remorse for the killing. By 1979, a small group of his friends on the outside had begun a campaign for his conditional discharge. By the spring of 1980, the campaign had reached the Home Office and the necessary medical reports had been compiled and approved. He was discharged from Broadmoor on the 21st of July, 1980. The condition of release was that he be returned to the United States and placed in the care of a responsible family member, with continuing outpatient psychiatric supervision in New York. The responsible family member, by the only available option, was his grandmother, Nini Daly, the same woman whose breakdown had preceded Barbara's birth, who was now 87 years old, who lived alone in a small apartment on East 79th Street in Manhattan, and who had agreed, out of love and against the advice of nearly everyone who knew her, to take him in. He boarded a British Airways flight at Heathrow on the afternoon of the 21st of July. He arrived at John F. Kennedy International Airport in New York that evening. Nini was waiting at the arrivals barrier. She put her arms around him. She drove him home to the apartment. She made him supper. She showed him the room she had prepared for him. 6 days later, he tried to kill her. Chapter 11. 6 days in New York with a kitchen knife. On the 21st of July, 1980, Tony Baekeland walked out of Broadmoor and into the care of an 87-year-old woman. For the first 2 days at the apartment on East 79th Street, he was, by Nini's later account, to police and to the family lawyer, calm and grateful and easy. He ate, he slept. He took the medication that had been sent across from Broadmoor in a brown bottle. He sat in the small living room and read. He went out twice with his grandmother for short walks. He cried once on the second evening in the kitchen while she made him an omelet. He said it was the first time in 7 years he had been outside a wall. On the third day, he stopped taking the medication. He told Nini that morning that the medication made his head feel thick and that he did not need it any longer. He had been clean at Broadmoor for 2 years. He believed he was well. She did not insist. She was an old, frail woman who had absorbed too many shocks in her life to insist on anything. She thought, she later said, that perhaps he was right. By the 4th day, he was sleeping poorly. By the 5th day, he had begun to talk to the corner of the room again. By the 6th day, which was the 27th of July, the angel was back. The angel, by Tony's later statement to a New York detective, told him that morning that his grandmother was the obstacle. The angel told him that his grandmother had loved Barbara more than she had loved him. The angel told him that the act of 1972 had been incomplete, and that the line of women, going back through Nini and Barbara to the cousins and the aunts, needed to be ended. The angel told him to use the kitchen. He used the kitchen. He selected a long kitchen knife from the drawer. He walked into the small living room, where Nini was sitting in an armchair by the window, reading a magazine. He attacked her. He stabbed her, by the later medical report, 8 times. He stabbed her in the chest, the abdomen, the upper arm, and the left thigh. He broke 3 of her ribs and her left wrist in the course of the struggle. She fought. She was, despite her age and her frailty, a woman who had spent her whole life surviving worse than she had been given to survive. And she fought. She screamed. A neighbor, an elderly man across the corridor, heard the screams. He came out of his apartment. He hammered on the door. He went back to his own apartment and dialed 911. He returned and continued to hammer on the door. The hammering, by Tony's later statement, broke the angel's grip. Tony stopped. He stood up. He looked at his grandmother. He went to the kitchen sink. He washed his hands. He walked to the door. He opened it. He said to the neighbor, in the calm and pleasant tone he was capable of, that he thought there had been an accident. The neighbor, an octogenarian himself, pushed past him into the apartment, saw Nini on the floor, and applied a wet towel to the worst of the wounds. The paramedics arrived within 7 minutes. The police arrived within 10. Nini was taken to Lenox Hill Hospital. She required 4 hours of surgery. She survived. She would live, against every expectation, until 1983. Tony was arrested in the apartment. He did not resist. He was taken to the local precinct, then transferred to the medical unit at Bellevue Hospital for psychiatric evaluation, then transferred to the City Department of Correction facility at Rikers Island in the East River, pending trial on charges of attempted murder, assault in the first degree, and possession of a deadly weapon. He was held at Rikers for the next 8 months. The conditions at Rikers were nothing like the conditions at Broadmoor. Rikers was a vast, overcrowded, violent jail complex that held some of the most damaged and dangerous men in New York City. Tony, the slim blonde English-speaking heir from a London penthouse, was an obvious target. He was assigned to a protective custody wing. He was kept in a single cell. He was visited less frequently than at Broadmoor by a small handful of family lawyers and old friends from the international set. He was treated, according to the prison medical reports, with the standard antipsychotic medication of the period. He did not eat well. He lost weight. He stopped writing letters. He was scheduled for a preliminary hearing on the 20th of March, 1981. The hearing took place at the criminal court in Lower Manhattan on the morning of that day. He attended in a city-issue gray suit, accompanied by his attorney and by 2 corrections officers. The hearing was procedural. It lasted approximately 40 minutes. The case was adjourned for the assignment of a trial date. He was returned to Rikers by van. He arrived at the medical wing of the facility at approximately 3 o'clock in the afternoon. He was processed through the standard intake procedure. He was returned to his cell at approximately 3:30. A corrections officer on a routine cell check approximately 30 minutes later, at 4 o'clock, found Anthony Daly Baekeland dead on the floor of his cell. He had tied a plastic bag, of the kind issued for the disposal of laundry, tightly around his head. He had asphyxiated himself. He had left no note. He was 34 years old. He had survived his mother by 8 years and 4 months. the material that his great-grandfather Leo had invented in the laboratory at Snug Rock in 1907, the material that had built the family fortune and bought the apartment at 71st Street, and the penthouse at Cadogan Square, and the rented houses at Klosters and Cap d'Antibes and Mallorca, the material with which his mother had decorated his childhood, and his father had paid for his schools, and the international set had eaten its dinners off, was the material with which, on the floor of a cell in the East River, he ended his life. Chapter 12. What the Bakelite could not hold together. The material that built the Bakeland fortune was the material that ended it. That is the line, the closing line, the line that has been used in every retelling for 54 years. It is true. It is also too neat. It is the kind of poetic resolution the story does not entirely deserve, because nothing about the Bakeland tragedy was as clean as a single closing image. The tragedy was longer than that. The tragedy was wider than that. The tragedy implicates more people than the two who left the room. Begin with what is structurally true. A fortune was built by one man, Leo Baekeland, through 15 years of patient experimentation and one specific afternoon of insight in 1907. That fortune passed to his son George, who could not manage it and who took his own life. It passed to his grandson Brooks, who refused to do anything productive with it. It reached his great-grandson Tony as the only heir of the only male line, and Tony, by the time the fortune reached him, was a paranoid schizophrenic in his teens. The pattern, viewed from a long enough distance, is a recognizable American pattern. The founder works, the grandson manages, badly. The great-grandson, raised in money without function, comes apart. Continue with what is socially true. The international set of the 1950s and 60s, the world of rented villas and 20 trunks and Greta Garbo at the dinners, was not a community that intervened. It was a community of witnesses. It was a community of people who flew in for the parties and flew out before the disasters, and who, when the disasters arrived, told each other the stories with a half-guilty thrill at having been close enough to the fire to feel the heat without having to put it out. There were friends of Barbara's who saw what was happening in Mallorca in the summer of 1968 and who did not telephone Brooks. There were friends of Tony's who watched him deteriorate at dinner parties between 1969 and 1972 and who did not call a doctor on their own initiative. There were friends of both who knew that Dr. Jacobs had warned Barbara in October 1972, and who, even after they heard the warning, sent dinner invitations as if nothing had been said. Continue with what is medically true. The mental health systems of London and New York in the late 1960s and early 1970s were structurally incapable of overriding the wishes of a wealthy mother. Tony was admitted to psychiatric care at least 4 times in those years, and was released every time on Barbara's signature. The system did not have, and did not invent, a mechanism for saying that a competent mother's love for her son was itself a clinical danger, and that the son needed to be separated from her against her will. That mechanism would have required, in 1972 London, a level of state intervention into wealthy family life that the law did not authorize and that the public would not have supported. It is the kind of legal and clinical absence that produces every few years a particular kind of family tragedy. The Bakeland murder was one of the more spectacular cases. It was not the only one. Continue with what is personally true. Barbara Daly Bakeland was the wounded child of a father's suicide and of a mother's breakdown. She invented herself out of nothing she had been born with. She married the man she had selected on instinct at 21. She constructed a salon. She built a son. She lost the marriage. She held on to the son with the only kind of love she knew how to give, which was a love that consumed. She drank. She suffered. She tried 4 times to take her own life. She refused in the autumn of 1972 to send her son away. She paid for that refusal in the kitchen on the 17th of November. Brooks Bakeland lived another 35 years after Barbara's death. He lived them in the stone house in Brittany with Sylvie and the son he had had with her. He did not, when Barbara died, return for the funeral. He did not, when Tony went to Broadmoor, visit him. He did not, when Tony died at Rikers, claim the body. He wrote, after Tony's death, a long open letter to a literary magazine in which he explained to the world that he had been the victim of his wife's pathology and his son's illness, and that no responsible reading of the family history could lay any blame at his door. He died in 2007 in the stone house of natural causes, at the age of 87. He had outlived everyone, and with what is the harder truth. The Baekeland story has been retold in books and films and magazine pieces and now in podcasts for more than 50 years. Every retelling, including the one you have just heard, depends on the same audience appetite. We are drawn to this story because it gives us the spectacle of beautiful, rich, ill, doomed people destroying each other in expensive rooms. We are drawn to it for the same reason Barbara's friends came to the dinners. We are drawn to it because the gilded surface promised that the wealth would make these people invulnerable, and the wealth did not. And the gap between the promise and the reality is the gap into which our attention always falls. Every family that loses its founding function and replaces it with money alone. Every grandchild raised in inherited wealth without inherited purpose. Every mother who cannot release the son who is breaking her. Every son who cannot survive the mother who is loving him to death. Every father who walks out and writes a letter explaining that none of it was his fault. Every friend who watches and does not intervene. Every doctor who is overruled by a signature. Every audience member who reads the long magazine piece and feels, for a moment, lifted out of their own life by the spectacle of someone else's collapse. Barbara Baekeland is more famous now, in 2026, than she ever was at the height of her parties. Tony Baekeland is better known now than he ever was as a beautiful child, at the long mahogany table at 71st Street. Leo Baekeland, the chemist who built the fortune, is increasingly forgotten. The plastic he invented is everywhere. The family name appears in chemical engineering textbooks. The murder is what people remember. The murder is what we are still telling each other about. What does that say? What does that say about the appetite that keeps Barbara visible? What does that say about the silence of the friends who stopped sending invitations? What does that say about the system that could not separate a mother from her son in time? What does that say about us sitting in our houses, listening to the story now, in the warm and unjudging space of an evening, halfway through a Friday, the way Barbara herself spent her last hour before she came home for lunch? If you have made it this far, you already know the kind of story I tell here, so subscribe so you do not miss the next one. And in the comments below, tell me this. Do you believe Barbara Baekeland was destroyed by her son, by her husband, by her wealth, or by herself?